Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Michael Chikeen, and today in the virtual studio, I'm joined by Professor Kevin Mitchell. Kevin is an associate professor of genetics and developmental neurobiology at Trinity College Dublin, where he spends his days untangling one of life's more interesting questions: how strings of DNA self-assemble into a brain that can fall in love, write sonnets, or binge-watch Netflix and feel guilty about it later. He's also the author of two books: Innate, How the Wiring of Our Brains Shapes Who We Are, and more recently, Free Agents, How Evolution Gave Us Free Will. If you've ever blamed a bad decision on your genes, Kevin's work politely points out that the story is both messier and more empowering than that. So today we're diving into some nature versus nurture, whether free will is anything more than great marketing, and more topics that cause most of us a migraine if we think too deeply about them. But Kevin Mitchell, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks very much for having me.
Well, I guess let's start with, a lot of people say that our genes hardwire us to be who we are, and we kind of just follow those paths in the future, and we're kind of along for the ride. So maybe in more layman's terms, plain English, like, why do you think maybe that view is a bit too simplistic?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because there's a germ of truth to it, right? It just gets extrapolated too far. So, I mean, basically, you can think of the human genome as kind of a set of instructions for making a human being, right? In general, in the same way that a dog genome is instructions for making a dog, cat genome for a cat, and so on, right? So, but the thing is, like, none of us has the human genome. We all have our own version of it, and so the version that I have is different from the version that you have, and that partly explains the differences between, say, how we look, right? So our physical features and how tall we are and everything else, right? So we're used to that. We're used to the idea that people resemble their relatives, for example, physically, but they also resemble their relatives psychologically and, in a sense, behaviorally. So when we look at people's behavior and we analyze it in some way, you know, there's various ways of measuring that, then what we can see is that, you know, twins, for example, or siblings or parents and offspring are more similar to each other psychologically than just, you know, any two random people would be. And so, you know, the reason for that is that our genes don't just build our body, our physical body, they build our brains. And the way that our brains are wired is responsible in general for human nature, just broadly speaking. But then the variations on the way our brains are wired are, let's say, contribute to our individual nature, or at least the way that it starts, right? So we really don't start as blank slates with no differences, you know, from each other. We really do have some differences in the way our brains are structured, and we can literally physically see that in, you know, imaging the brain of, say, twins right from the get-go. We can already see you know, some similarities between the twins and differences with unrelated people, and those things manifest then in our patterns of behavior. Now, the question is, how do they manifest, right? And it's easy to take that idea too far. So first, let me say, you can look at traits like personality traits, for example. So things like neuroticism or extroversion or conscientiousness. There's a whole bunch of other measures that psychologists can look at, right? And when you do a questionnaire for extroversion, for example, you'll get a score. It's just an arbitrary number, and it's useful for comparing people, right? Some people have higher score than others.
Right.
Now, if you look at the differences across the population, you can see that a fair proportion of that difference that you see is due to genetic differences. Maybe something like 40% of all of the differences that you see in the population are caused by or attributable to genetic differences.
Okay.
So the first thing to say is, yes, there's a genetic contribution to those traits, but we can notice two things about it. One is it's not nothing, and two is it's not 100%, right? So right from the get-go, there's clearly non-genetic influences on what makes people more or less extroverted. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, just as a limit to ideas of genetic determinism.
Okay.
But then the other thing is to say, okay, well, what does this trait, you know, what does a measure like extroversion actually capture? And, you know, psychologists have designed these measures to try and abstract away from the particulars of any individual and get at principles that apply across the whole population, right? That's what they're trying to do, is understand the structure of human personality in general. They're not really trying to understand your personality or mine. They want the general rules, right? So the measures by design abstract away from the particulars of an individual or their life or the situations that they find themselves in. Right? So they're really kind of patterns. They're more like climate than weather, right? It's like, okay, it tends to be sunnier in Barcelona than in Dublin, but actually right now it's quite sunny in Dublin, right? So they're sort of statistical abstractions away from the details, right? And the way that I like to think of them is that, yes, you do come with these psychological predispositions. You may be tuned a little higher on some of these traits than others. And those do affect your behavior. They influence your behavior, but not in a way that, like, moment to moment, your behavior is being determined by how extroverted you are or how conscientious you are, because those are just very broad patterns. They don't have any information about the context in which you find yourself, right? They capture nothing about your history of experience that has led you to act in certain ways, given what you know about the world and so on. So it's just the starting point.
Right.
And then it sort of colors how you interact with the world. It captures a kind of a mode of being, where different people have a slightly different mode of being in the world.
Sure.
But over time, most of our behavior is actually driven by what we know about the situations we find ourselves in, what we've learned is a good thing to do, what our goals are, what our interests are and attitudes, and so on. So it just gets much, much more complicated. So yes, we don't start as a blank slate, but just because a slate isn't blank doesn't mean it can't be written on still.